What if I told you the U.S. Air Force has a major aircraft program the Pentagon tried to cancel, and Congress just brought it back with $1 billion boost? Today, we're talking about the E-7 Wedgetail, America's next airborne eyes in the sky, and why its funding suddenly surged. The headline, a draft FY 2026 Defense Appropriations Bill includes $1.1 billion for the E-7 program. That's a big jump compared to what was already in motion. A defense policy bill, known as the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, became law in December and already approved about $846.7 million for the E-7. On top of that, Congress previously added another $200 million in a short-term spending bill signed in November after a shutdown fight. Put simply, lawmakers are going out of their way to keep Wedgetail alive and to keep it moving. And they're not being subtle about it. In the explanatory language tied to the spending bill, Congress says the E-7 and its mission, airborne early warning and battle management, are important enough to justify this funding surge. The bill also directs the Secretary of the Air Force to deliver a plan to Congress within 90 days of the act being enacted. The goal? Streamline requirements and control costs so future production doesn't spiral. Now, why does the E-7 matter? Because it's meant to replace the Air Force's aging E-3 Sentry, better known as AWACS. The E-3 has been the iconic flying radar dish for decades, but the fleet is shrinking and getting harder to keep in the air. The Air Force has 16 E-3s remaining, and they provide critical capabilities: early warning, tracking, data sharing, and command and control. The problem is these aircraft are old, maintenance is difficult, and operational availability becomes more challenging every year. Enter the E-7 Wedgetail. It's based on the Boeing 737 airframe, and instead of the big rotating dome, it uses a newer radar and modern systems in a more efficient package. In everyday terms, it's a newer generation of airborne battle management, better sensors, better networking, better fuel economy, and a platform that's already proven internationally. Versions of the E-7 are already in service with Australia, South Korea, and Turkey. The United Kingdom is still on track to field it as well, even though NATO previously canceled its own shared E-7 plan after the US withdrew from that effort. So if the case is so clear, why was the Pentagon trying to cancel it? Last year, the Department of Defense moved to shut the E-7 program down. The Air Force's request for FY 2026 funding was just under $200 million, but here's the twist. That money wasn't for building the future. It was explicitly to support closing the program out, including things like a full financial audit. Instead of Wedgetail, Pentagon planners pitched a two-part alternative. First, buy more E-2D Hawkeye aircraft as an interim solution while E-3s retire. Second, shift much of the airborne target warning mission into space over time, using satellites to track targets persistently. That alternative sparked a lot of pushback. For one, the E-2D Hawkeye is a Navy aircraft designed for carrier operations. It's great at what it does, but it's also a smaller platform with constraints that come from that carrier mission. Critics questioned whether it's a realistic stand-in for the Air Force's needs at scale, especially the broader battle management role. Then there's survivability. Pentagon officials raised concerns about the E-7's vulnerability in a high-end conflict, like a potential fight in the Pacific. But skeptics noted that survivability concerns don't magically disappear with the E-2. If you're operating in contested airspace, both types face risk, and the E-7, as a larger platform, may offer more room to grow into expanded mission demands, like acting as a major networking and coordination node. The space-based angle is even more complicated. U.S. officials have talked up progress on tracking targets on the ground and at sea from orbit, but tracking aircraft from space is a different challenge. Space Force leadership has pointed out that ground-moving target tracking and air-moving target tracking aren't just one letter apart in difficulty. They require different fidelity,
different tracking quality and dealing with much faster movement in the air. So, while space-based sensing is promising, many observers doubt it can replace airborne radar and battle management fast enough to cover the gap created as E-3s age out. That's where Congress comes in. Since last summer, lawmakers have steadily moved to protect Wedgetail. The FY 2026 NDAA was the first big piece of legislation to lock that support into law, and it even included a provision to block the retirement of any E-3s during the current fiscal cycle. Now the appropriations draft takes it further, boosting funding and adding language that prohibits using funds to pause, cancel, or terminate the E-7 program.
So what happens next? Even with more money, timelines are still uncertain. The Air Force had been working toward 2 initial production representative aircraft for testing and evaluation, a stepping stone to a full U.S.-specific configuration. At one point, the Air Force hoped to have E-7s flying missions in 2027, but later reporting cited a push to 2032 for initial operational capability. In other words, Congress may be throwing fuel on the fire, but turning funding into operational aircraft still takes time, especially if requirements change and costs rise. The bigger takeaway is this: the E-7 program's fortunes have flipped dramatically in a year. The Pentagon tried to end it. Congress is now protecting it, funding it, and demanding a plan to keep it affordable. And that tells you something important about where lawmakers think the Air Force is headed. They're not ready to bet the airborne early warning mission on stopgap aircraft and future satellites alone. They want a modern airborne command and control platform, and they want it now. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, should the US go all in on Wedgetail or shift faster towards space-based tracking and distributed systems?